The May 4th movement was an anti-imperialist, cultural and political movement growing out of student participants in Beijing on May 4, 1919, protesting against the Chinese government's weak response to the Treaty of Versailles, especially allowing Japan to receive territories in Shandong which had been surrendered by Germany after the Siege of Tsingtao. These demonstrations sparked national protests and marked the upsurge of Chinese nationalism, a shift towards political mobilization and away from cultural activities, and a move towards a populist base rather than intellectual elites. Many political and social leaders of the next decades emerged at this time. The term May 4th movement, in a broader sense, often refers to the period during 1915 to 1921, more often called the New Culture Era movement. Background: the atmosphere and political mood that emerged around 1919, in the words of one recent scholar, are at the center of a set of ideas that has shaped China's momentous 20th century. Following the Xinhai Revolution in 1911, the Qing dynasty disintegrated. This marked the end of thousands of years of powerful imperial rule, and theoretically ushered a new era in which political power rested with the people. However, the reality was that China was a fragmented nation dominated by warlords, who were more concerned with their own political powers and private armies than national interests. The Chinese Beijing government was occupied with suppressing internal affairs, and did little to counter the influence exerted by foreign powers. The March 1st movement that happened in Korea, the Russian Revolution, defeats by foreign powers and the presence of spheres of influence inflamed a sense of nationalism among the emerging middle class and cultural leaders. Leaders of the New Culture Era movement believed that traditional Confucian values were responsible for the political weakness of the nation. Chinese nationalists called for a rejection of traditional values and the selective adoption of Western ideals of Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy in order to strengthen the new nation. These iconoclastic and anti-traditional views and programs have shaped China's politics and culture down to the present. Shandong Problem. China had entered World War I on the side of the Allied Triple Entente in 1917 with the condition that all German spheres of influence, such as Shandong, would be returned to China. Although in that year 140,000 Chinese laborers were sent to France, the Versailles Treaty of April 1919 awarded German rights in Shandong province to Japan. The representatives of the Chinese government put forth the following requests: abolition of all privileges of foreign powers in China, such as extraterritoriality, cancelling of the 21 demands with the Japanese, return to China of the territory and rights of Shandong, which Japan had taken from Germany during World War I. The Western Allies dominated the meeting at Versailles, and paid little heed to Chinese demands. Britain and France were primarily interested in punishing Germany. Although the United States promoted Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and the ideals of self-determination, they were unable to advance these ideals in the face of stubborn resistance by David Lloyd George Clemenceau and the U.S. Congress. American advocacy of self-determination at the League of Nations was attractive to Chinese intellectuals, but the failure to follow through was seen as a betrayal. Chinese diplomatic failure at the Paris Peace Conference touched off the May 4th movement and became known as the Shandong Problem. The days of protest. On the morning of May 4, 1919, student representatives from 13 different local universities met in Beijing and drafted 5 resolutions to oppose the granting of Shandong to the Japanese under former German concessions, to draw awareness of China's precarious position to the masses in China, to recommend a large-scale gathering in Beijing, to promote the creation of a Beijing student union, to hold a demonstration that afternoon in protest to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. On the afternoon of May 4, over 3,000 students of Peking University and other schools marched from many points to gather in front of Tiananmen. They shouted such slogans as "Struggle for the sovereignty externally, get rid of the national traitors at home, do away with the 21 demands, and don't sign the Versailles Treaty." They voiced their anger at the Allied betrayal of China, denounced the government's spineless inability to protect Chinese interests, and called for a boycott of Japanese products. Demonstrators insisted on the resignation of 3 Chinese officials they accused of being collaborators with the Japanese. After burning the residence of one of these officials and beating his servants, student protesters were arrested, jailed, and severely beaten. The next day, students in Beijing as a whole went on strike, and in the larger cities across China, students, patriotic merchants, and workers joined protests. The demonstrators skillfully appealed to the newspapers and sent representatives to carry the word across the country. From early June, workers and businessmen in Shanghai also went on strike as the center of the movement shifted from Beijing to Shanghai. Chancellors from 13 universities arranged for the release of student prisoners, and Ai Yuanpei, the principal of Peking University, resigned in protest. Newspapers, magazines, citizens' societies, and chambers of commerce offered support for the students. Merchants threatened to withhold tax payments if China's government remained obstinate. In Shanghai, a general strike of merchants and workers nearly devastated the entire Chinese economy. Under intense public pressure, the Beijing government released the arrested students and dismissed Cao Rulan, Zhang Zongxiang, and Lu Zongyu. Chinese representatives in Paris refused to sign the peace treaty. The May 4 movement won an initial victory which was primarily symbolic. Since Japan for the moment retained control of the Shandong Peninsula and the islands in the Pacific, even the partial success of the movement exhibited the ability of China's social classes across the country to successfully collaborate given proper motivation and leadership. Birth of Chinese communism. For many years, the orthodox view in the People's Republic of China was that after the demonstrations in 1919 and the suppression, the discussion became more and more political. People like Chen Duxiu and Li Dazhao shifted more to the left and were among the leading founders of the 1921 Communist Party of China, whilst other intellectuals, such as the anarchist right-wing agitator Ba Jin, also took part in the movement. Originally voluntarist and nihilist figures like Li Shisen and Zhou Qiangji made similar turns to the left as the 1920s saw China become increasingly turbulent. Mao Zedong claimed that the May 4 movement was a stage leading toward revolution. The May 4 movement 20 years ago marked a new stage in China's bourgeois democratic revolution against imperialism and feudalism. The cultural reform movement which grew out of the May 4 movement was only one of the manifestations of this revolution. With the growth and development of new social forces in that period, a powerful camp made its appearance in the bourgeois democratic revolution, a camp consisting of the working class, the student masses, and the new national bourgeoisie. Around the time of the May 4 movement, hundreds of thousands of students courageously took their place in the van. In these respects, the May 4 movement went a step beyond the revolution of 1911. The May 4 movement served as an intellectual turning point in China. It was a seminal event that radicalized Chinese intellectual thought. Western-style liberal democracy had previously had a degree of traction amongst Chinese intellectuals, but after the Versailles Treaty, lost much of its attractiveness. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, despite being rooted in moralism, were also seen as Western-centric and hypocritical. Many in the Chinese intellectual community believed that the United States had done little to convince the imperialist powers to adhere to the 14 points, and observed that the United States itself had declined to join the League of Nations. As a result, they turned away from the Western liberal, democratic model. Marxism began to take hold in Chinese intellectual thought, particularly among those already on the left. It was during this time that communism was studied seriously by some Chinese intellectuals such as Chen Duxiu and Li Dazhao. Historical significance. Scholars rank the New Culture and May 4th movements as significant turning points, along with the abolition of the civil service system in 1905 and the overthrow of the monarchy in 1911. Participants at the time, such as Hu Shi, referred to this era as the Chinese Renaissance because there was an intense focus on science and experimentation. The challenge to traditional Chinese values, however, was also met with strong opposition, especially from the Nationalist Party. For the perspective, the movement destroyed the positive elements of Chinese tradition and placed a heavy emphasis on direct political actions and radical attitudes, characteristics associated with the emerging Chinese Communist Party. On the other hand, the Communist Party, whose two founders, Li Dazhao and Chen Duxiu, were leaders of the movement, viewed it more favorably, although remaining suspicious of the early phase, which emphasized the role of enlightened intellectuals, not revolution. In its broader sense, the May 4th movement led to the establishment of radical intellectuals who went on to mobilize peasants and workers into the Communist Party and gained the organizational strength that would solidify the success of the Communist Revolution. Criticism and resistance. Although the movement was highly influential, many of the intellectuals at the time opposed the anti-traditional message and many political figures ignored it. Chiang Kai-shek, as a nationalist and Confucianist, was against the iconoclasm of the May 4th movement. As an anti-imperialist, he was skeptical of Western ideas and literature. He and Dr. Sun Yat-sen criticized these May 4th intellectuals for corrupting morals of youth. When the Nationalist Party came to power under Chiang's rule, it carried out the opposite agenda. The New Life movement promoted Confucianism, and the Kuomintang purged China's education system of Western ideas, introducing Confucianism into the curriculum. Textbooks, exams, degrees and educational instructors were all controlled by the state, as were all universities. Some conservative philosophers and intellectuals opposed any change, but many more accepted or welcomed the challenge from the West but wanted to base new systems on Chinese values, not imported ones. These figures included Liang Shuming, Liu Shipei, Tao Zisheng, Zhong Shili, Zhang Binglan and Lu Xun's brother, Zhe Zuoren. In later years, others developed critiques, including figures as diverse as Lin Yutong, Qian Mu, Zhu Fuguan, and Yu Yingxi. Chinese Muslims ignored the May 4th movement by continuing to teach classical Chinese and literature with the Quran and Arabic, along with officially mandated contemporary subjects at the Normal Islamic School of Wangxian. A classical Chinese translation of the Quran was done by Ha Dekeng. Arabic, vernacular Chinese, classical Chinese, and the Quran were taught in Ningxia Islamic schools funded by Muslim General Mahfouz Zhang. Neo-traditionalism versus Western thought. Although the May 4th movement did find partial success in removing Chinese traditional culture, there were still proponents who steadfastly argued that China's traditions and values should be the fundamental foundation of the nation. For these opponents of Western civilization derived three neo-traditional schools of thought: national essence, national character, and modern relevance of Confucianism. Each school of thought denounced the Western values of individualism, materialism, and utilitarianism as inadequate avenues for the development of China. Each school held to specific objectives. The national essence school sought to discover aspects of traditional culture that could potentially serve the national development of China. Such traditional aspects consisted of various philosophical and religious practices that emerged parallel with Confucianism. Most particularly, China imported Buddhism, a religion from the neighboring countries, India and Nepal. Under the national character school, advocates promoted the traditional family system, the primary target of the May 4th movement. In this school, reformers viewed Westerners as shells without morals. Finally, the modern relevance of Confucianism was centered on the notion that Confucian values were better than Western ones. In response to Western culture's primary concentration on rational analysis, China's neo-traditionalists argued that this was misguided, especially in the practical, changing milieu of the world. Most importantly, these three neo-traditionalist thoughts gave no consideration to the individual, which was the main theme of the May 4th movement.